Welcome to the Modulate podcast, Jewels of the North, the Renaissance outside of Italy. In this module, as you may have guessed, we will be studying the work of Renaissance painters who were working outside of Italy, specifically those who were working in Northern Europe, in places like Flanders and the Netherlands and Germany. Now, if you're like me, you're probably wondering, what is Flanders? Where is that? These next two maps both have Flanders on them. The first one, it is the area that has the little sort of oval around it, and in the one on the right, it is marked by a small sort of bluish area and labeled Flanders. This is a part of Europe that kind of straddles the border between modern day France and Belgium. And we call painters who worked in Flanders Flemish painters. The other region, as I said, is the Netherlands. You can see that in the left-hand map above and to the right of Flanders. And of course, this roughly approximates modern-day Holland, and we call these Dutch painters. We'll also be looking at a couple of artists from Germany, so you can see Germany there to the right as well. Now, the art being produced in these regions during the Renaissance is going to be different in style and also medium or type of paint used from that in Europe. So let's look at just a few differences between Northern Renaissance painting and Italian painting during the Renaissance. For one thing, the type of paint that's used is a little bit different. Most of the great paintings we looked at by Michelangelo and Raphael were frescoes, that is, paintings done in wet plaster on walls. What we're going to see in Northern Europe is oil paint on wooden panels. That is kind of those are the main materials that are used. Another difference between the two really relates to philosophy of perception. If you'll recall, in Italy, we had these great Italian humanist painters really obsessed with the underlying structure of works, with perfect geometric forms underlying their paintings. We had things like Leonardo's The Last Supper, with all the perspective lines going to the head of Christ. We have him breaking up his figures into evenly divided groups. There's kind of geometric order and mathematical harmony, and that's something that the Italians were very interested in during the Renaissance. In the north, in Flanders and the Netherlands and so forth, the painters don't care as much about that. They're much more interested in the surface details of things. They have this real love of different kinds of textures. For example, shiny silk or satin, jewels that might be on a crown, hair, the smoothness of skin. They're really interested in surface textures. And so instead of celebrating underlying structures, they're going to be very much about the surface. They want to create paintings that you can almost have this tactile sensation with, sort of an experience of touch. That'll probably make more sense once we look at some examples of that. A final difference between the Renaissance and the North and the South relates to humanism. As you'll recall, these Italian painters were extremely influenced by the classical civilization that surrounded them in ruins, and they were obsessed with their Greco-Roman heritage and wanted to sort of tap into the humanistic spirit of the Greeks. Well, that concept was not as strong in places like the Netherlands and France and Germany and so forth. Uh, the idealized nude human form is not a big player in the subject matter that we're going to look at. There are some nudes, but they're typically not idealized nudes. They are nudes that are observed in a very matter-of-fact way. And they're certainly not the heroic demigods that we see in so many Italian nude figures. One thing the North and the South both had in common, though, is their commitment to observation, to looking at the world around them and trying to figure out ways to reproduce it. So that, of course, is something that defines them both sort of under the category of Renaissance painting. It was an interest that was common to Italy as well as the North. Just real quickly, these are the artists we're going to look at. Jan van Eyck, Hieronymus Bosch, Matthias Grunewald, and Hans Holbein the Younger. An assortment of artists from Flanders and the Netherlands and Germany. And our last stop before actually looking at the artwork, wanted you to have some vocabulary under your belt. First, a lot of the paintings we're going to look at were intended to go in either churches or private chapels. A rich family, for example, might have their own little family chapel on their estate, and that's where some of the artwork might go. Several of these pieces that we're about to see are called altarpieces. And an altarpiece is simply a large painting that, as you might guess, goes over an altar, usually at the eastern end of a church. It provides a visual focus during worship services, and if your mind starts to wander, you can look at the altarpiece and be brought back to thinking about spiritual things. The next three words you see on your vocabulary list are types of altarpieces: triptych, diptych, and polyptych. A triptych is an altarpiece that is composed of three panels, and very often a triptych altarpiece, the two panels on the sides will be hinged, and they will swing in and cover up the panel in the middle. Not all the time, but that's something we're certainly going to see in this module. A diptych, as you might guess, is two panels. A polyptych is an altarpiece that is made of just multiple panels, more than two. These last two terms, Annunciation and Memento Mori, those are specialized words when you're talking about religious painting. An Annunciation painting is a picture of the angel Gabriel visiting Mary and telling her that she is going to bear a son. The Memento Mori is a Latin term that means reminder of death or remember that you will die. And that is any painting that's intended to sort of face you with your own mortality. If you don't remember that right now, that's okay. I'll show you some examples of that, and hopefully this will explain these two terms a little better. By the way, several of the paintings that we're about to look at are absolutely some of my favorites. So I hope you like them too. The Italian Renaissance is great, it's grand, it's wonderful. You should go to Italy and see all that stuff. It's amazing. But I feel for me personally, a lot of this Northern Renaissance painting is where my heart lies. So here we go. Let's look at our first work here. This is by a painter named Jan van Eyck. He is a Flemish painter, and he had a brother named Hubert van Eyck, and the two brothers originally started off as miniature painters. Remember, this is the days before photography, and if you wanted to carry around a picture of a loved one, you got a miniature painter to do a portrait that you carried in a locket or something like that. So that's what the Van Eyck brothers did, and that's where they got their training, and that's how they initially made their living, and that is a very demanding discipline. Keep in mind that artists who do this are going to be using brushes that are like one hair wide, and they're painting these little tiny details. So you can really see this love of detail come out in a painting like this first one called the Ghent altarpiece. By the way, Hubert probably helped Jan get this altarpiece started, and then inconveniently Hubert died. But Hubert was highly esteemed as an oil painter. Some say he was the father of oil painting, which is, he probably didn't invent it, but he was good enough to sort of have that reputation of oil painting awesomeness. There's a story about Hubert that when he died, they cut off his right arm and they preserved it as a relic. I guess that was his painting arm. So, regardless of how much he participated in the Ghent altarpiece, tradition really esteems Hubert. But apparently, Jan did most of this painting. This painting is technically a polyptych made of multiple panels. You might be able to look at that and see the way the frame is built and all the figures are sort of sectioned off by themselves. But the way it's glued and attached together, it's almost like a triptych. There is an outside that is covered by these hinged doors, and you can see that in this image of the exterior of the Ghent altarpiece. And then you sort of split it down the middle and swing open these two panels, and you get this next image. This is the interior, and you can see sort of the silhouettes along the top and how those swing around and cover the middle panel. Here's the main idea of this painting. This painting is one of the great religious works in Western Europe. The outside of the painting, the exterior, is stuff about the coming of Christ. Christ is on the way. He's not here yet, but he's coming. The inside of the painting depicts the idea that Christ has come and he is reigning in glory. So the outside is about expectation and the inside is about fulfillment. Let's look in more detail at the outside. You can see there are some figures along the bottom. The two people in red on either side are the folks who funded this altarpiece. They are the patrons, so they are included there, looking like very pious, holy people. They're in an attitude of prayer. The two in the bottom section, the two figures that are painted to look like sculptures are John the Baptist on the left and John the Evangelist on the right. The middle register of this exterior is an annunciation scene. Again, the angel Gabriel coming to Mary and telling her that she will bear the Christ. Above them, you can see in the upper section of what we call lunettes or half moon or semicircular sort of shapes, we have Old Testament prophets and sibyls, if you'll remember those from the Sistine Chapel, all of whom predicted the coming of Christ. Here are some details from that middle section from the Annunciation scene, and I have removed the two middle panels so we can get the angel and Mary closer to each other. Something to think about as we look at a lot of this Northern Renaissance art is that everything is symbolic. The things that people hold, the shape of the architecture, the choices of environments that these people are put in, all of it has meaning, metaphorical meaning. And unfortunately, for a lot of us, that is lost on us because generally we're a pretty secular society. And I'm sure a lot of people who go and visit these great altarpieces don't know what the symbolism is either. But remember, a lot of these works are almost visual textbooks of doctrine and theology. And the people back in the day who would have been going to these churches or chapels where these paintings are located would have been able to read these things, to decode them. And to me, that's incredibly exciting to resurrect some of the symbolism from these bygone ages. For in many ways, these paintings are like puzzles that are waiting for a viewer to decipher them. Okay, but again, I'm digressing. Let's look at the Annunciation scene. Gabriel, in one panel, has just come into the room, and Gabriel is carrying a bunch of lilies. And lilies appear all the time in Annunciation paintings. They're a very common symbol. They refer to Mary's purity and goodness because they're white. And you see them all the time. So Gabriel has them in his hands. By the way, Gabriel looks kind of feminine. This is not any sort of angelic cross-dressing. This is still a man. Just one of the conventions for angels is sometimes they look kind of feminine. Look at the beautiful multicolored wings on Gabriel. You see this in angels a lot too. They have wings that are almost rainbow colored. Look over at Mary, and she's been reading a book. This is something you see in a lot of Annunciation paintings as well. Often she is reading from the prophets, reading prophecies about the coming of the Messiah. Notice there is a dove over her head. This, of course, is the dove of the Holy Spirit, and the dove, it's great. I love it. He's got this little halo, and he's sort of spreading out his wings as if to say, "Here I am." And the halo has three little rays coming off of it. There's a lot of Trinitarian symbolism throughout this painting. Things happen in groups of threes, suggesting the Father and the Son and the Spirit. This room is lavishly detailed. Every little tile in the floor has been painted. Uh, the curtains kind of in front of the table that Mary is reading at are painted. The background is painted. We have windows and we can see some buildings through those windows. Also, the clothing on the figures, every wrinkle is carefully depicted. This is our classic Northern Renaissance meticulousness about the surface of things. These painters love textures, so we definitely see that here. Notice that there is some sort of dialogue coming out of the mouths of these two figures. It's almost like a comic book. And the words that these two figures utter from Scripture are written beside their mouths. Gabriel is saying, "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." And this is where the whole Catholic Hail Mary thing comes from. It is directly from Scripture. Hail simply means greeting, so it's like saying, "Greetings, Mary," or "Howdy, Mary. The Lord is with you." Mary is saying, "Behold the handmaiden of the Lord," or "I am the Lord's servant." And the wonderfully charming thing about her dialogue in this painting is that it's written upside down. You might not know this because it's in a different language, but take my word for it, it is upside down. And the reason for this is it is her response to God. She's saying it in response to God, and so it's available for God to read. So those are just some of the details in this painting. We don't have time to go into all of them, but hopefully that gives you a little insight into some of the things going on in the exterior of the altarpiece. Now the exterior is kind of bland in color. Notice, for example, that the robes are sort of pale or kind of putty colored. When we open up this altarpiece, it absolutely explodes into jewel-like color, these vivid, vibrant hues that are just amazing. So let's open it up and look at it. Here we have basically a scene from the book of Revelation. We have the new heavens and the new earth. And in the upper strip, the entire upper strip from left to right, we have a heavenly scene. We have a figure in the upper middle who is either God the Father or Christ the Son. There's some scholarly debate about that. On his right hand is Mary, and no longer is she dressed in colorless garments. Now she has a rich robe of blue and she's wearing a crown. On the left-hand side of this figure, that is either Jesus or God, is John the Baptist. And no longer is he a statue. He is a real living person who is wearing a green robe. And what I love about the symbolism of this is the idea that the heavenly realms are more real than the earthly realms. They are not less real. They are not less solid. They are more vibrant and more solid. And I just absolutely love that. They are surrounded by sort of a cast of characters. We have angels who are singing in a choir, and we have another lady who is banging away on an organ. And look at the figures on the far left and far right in the upper section. Can you guess who they are? You probably can. This, of course, is Adam and Eve. More on them in a second. Let's zoom in and look at some of the details of these figures and talk about the symbolism that's going on. In this slide, we have our three central figures, Mary, the ruling figure in the middle, and then John the Baptist. And each of them has some words over their heads identifying them. The middle figure is identified as God. This is what the inscription above this figure says. This is God, all powerful in his divine majesty, of all the best, by the gentleness of his goodness, the most liberal giver because of his infinite generosity. Now, even though this text identifies this figure as God, it's still open for debate because he is presented as kind of a high priest, almost like a pope. And Jesus in Scripture is the great high priest. And compounding that is the fact that theologically, in Orthodox Christian belief, Jesus and God are the same person. Uh, or I should say, they are both God, maybe different persons of the Trinity, but they're both considered God. So that doesn't really, clear up the waters any. Uh, Added to the weight of evidence that this is possibly Jesus is this idea that you don't really depict God. You're not supposed to. Of course, Michelangelo is doing that down in Italy, and it is a more humanistic time, so it's possible it's God. I kind of lean into the interpretation that this is Jesus, but I've already gone on long enough about this. So let's look at some details. There is a crown at the feet of this figure, symbolic of the riches of the world being laid at his feet. All the kingdoms of God and all the goodness in the world rightfully belongs to God or Christ. And on the step that is right behind the crown that this figure's foot is on is one of the most wonderful inscriptions describing God in all of art history. Listen to this. It translates, "On his head, life without death. On his brow, youth without age. On his right, joy without sadness. On his left, security without fear." These are all good, positive things, and it speaks to the influence of Francis of Assisi and the humanism that he's brought into Christianity. Uh, these are not words that describe God as an angry judge ready to chop you down. These are benevolent words that describe a kind and loving Father of everything. So I just think that's wonderful and pretty cool. Some little details on this, of course, every jewel on the crown is detailed. The embroidery on the robe is carefully painted. Covering the back of the throne of this figure is a repeated embroidered pattern, and this shows a pelican and her baby chicks. The pelican, rather bizarrely, is taking her beak and piercing herself in the chest. And this references an old medieval superstition. Or, well, they didn't think it was a superstition, they thought it was a scientific fact that supposedly if a mama pelican can't find food for her babies, she will stab herself and bleed and feed her babies with her own blood. Of course, this doesn't really happen, but the folks back in the Middle Ages believed it did, and that kind of carried into the Renaissance. And of course, these people saw this as a symbol of the sacrifice of Christ, who spills his own blood to serve the people on earth. So, really, just beautiful symbolism there. Now, some other people in heaven. We mentioned Adam and Eve earlier, and here are some details of Adam and Eve. By the way, I just think it's great that Adam and Eve are in heaven. That just adds to the positive, hopeful aspects of this altarpiece. Because if Adam and Eve, who committed the first sins, made it into heaven, then there's a chance for all of us. And I just think it's great that they are up there. Look carefully at the vertical panels that Adam and Eve are in. They're painted in these kind of fake niches or recesses. And above them are these little sculptures that have been painted. They're fake sculptures, obviously, it's just a flat painting. But they are depictions of Cain and Abel. If you remember that story from the Bible, the sons of Adam and Eve, and they both offer sacrifices to God, and Abel's sacrifice is accepted, and Cain's is not. And Cain gets ticked off about this and kills his brother. You can see him wailing on Abel with a jawbone. So, again, this theme of sin and people bringing sin into the world, but even so, the sinners made it into heaven, at least Adam and Eve did. So, that is a really positive thing. And if there's a dominant sort of personality or spirit to this altarpiece, it is the idea that God is good, God rules over everything, and God is someday going to fix everything in the world, and we will look on his face one day and reign with him. Let's look at some more people in heaven. Here is an image of the choir, a close up of them. This is great. It is so human. Look at the faces. Look at how they're different. They're all doing different expressions. And some of them look like they're hitting the wrong notes. They're not sure if they're singing the right thing. That's the vibe I get from it anyway. I've heard some art historians write about this, and they said that back in the day, if you were in a choir, you made certain faces for certain notes, and supposedly musicologists have been able to look at this scene and figure out what notes everybody is singing. Uh, I don't know if that's true, but I read it somewhere, so that is certainly a possibility. I just think it is a lot of fun. Look at the exquisite detail. The robes have all these jewels on them. There's even, if you look at the angel or choir member on the right, there are little paintings of Jesus's face on the edges of her collar. Just marvelous. The stand that their music book is propped up on has detailing on it. There is no detail that's left untouched. I can't even begin to imagine how long it took Van Eyck or the Van Eyck boys to do this. Every hair on every head is carefully detailed. Here's another image from heaven. This is the lady who's playing the organ. This is actually Saint Cecilia, the patron saint of music. And you can see her pressing on a keyboard there. Supposedly, this is an extremely realistic depiction of a period organ. It is so realistic that some instrument makers have been able to reproduce organs from the past based in part on this painting and some of the details in it. So you got to give props to Van Eyck for doing his research and getting the musical instrument right. Okay, let's move from the heaven part of this painting to the lower part, which is kind of like the new earth. This is earth after Jesus has come back and fixed everything. And the imagery in this lower section is totally from the book of Revelation in the Bible. It's from Revelation chapter 22. And the central panel, especially, is the really famous one. It's called The Adoration of the Mystical Lamb. And here we see a lamb on an altar, and there is a wound in the chest of the lamb, and the lamb is bleeding into a chalice that is on the altar. And this, of course, is a reference to Jesus and his sacrifice and spilling his blood. And he's actually pouring his blood directly into the cup that suggests communion. So the symbolism of communion is right there on the altar. And Revelation describes Jesus in metaphorical terms. It describes him as a lamb looking as if he had been slain. And in this scene, he is surrounded by angels who are swinging incense burners. And people are coming from all four corners of the earth. You can actually see they're coming from all four corners of the painting, too, to worship the Lamb. And directly in front of the altar is a fountain, and there's water coming out of it. And at the base of the fountain is a little trench, and water is actually pouring towards us, the viewer. And again, all of this is from Revelation 22. And so, as I'm going to read an excerpt from this, and as I do, think about how this painting really embodies this imagery. Then he showed me a river of the water of life, clear as crystal, coming from the throne of God and of the Lamb. There will no longer be any curse, and the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his bondservants will serve him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. And there will no longer be any night, and they will not have any need of the light of the lamp, nor the light of the sun, because the Lord God will illumine them, and they will reign forever and ever. This is a scene, an embodiment of heavenly perfection, where there is no night, right? So I just think this is just a marvelous uh, way of imagining these texts from Revelation. Let's look at just a few more details in the bottom of this painting, then we'll move on to some more work. Each of these groups of people is a very specific group of people. We have Old Testament prophets, for example. We have the 12 apostles. We have popes and bishops. In the background, coming onto the scene, we have martyrs. One of the ways you can identify a martyr is that a martyr almost always has a palm branch, or very often has a palm branch. That's a symbol of martyrdom. It's also a reference to when Jesus was coming into Jerusalem on the donkey, and people laid down palm branches in front of his donkey as a way of honoring him. So now in this painting, we have these holy people who have given their lives up for Christ, who are coming in dressed in these beautiful robes and carrying these palm branches. Last, a couple of details to look at. In this slide, we see a group of monks and pilgrims coming in from the right-hand side of the painting. And there's just this little detail. There's this massive figure. Do you see him? The guy with the long beard and the red robe. I mean, it's pretty hard to miss. He's like a giant. This is Saint Christopher, the patron saint of pilgrims. And there's wonderful stories about Saint Christopher. Who knows if they're true? But he often has a massive walking stick. Sometimes it even looks like a tree trunk. So there he is. Look at the foliage in this painting. Every single leaf is detailed, every rock, every pebble. At no point do you have the sense that Van Eyck is slacking or sort of quickly going through something. Every part of this painting gets meticulous attention to detail. And I think that's one of the reasons people over the years have just absolutely loved it. So that's the Ghent altarpiece, a great artwork whose message is that God is going to redeem everything to himself and fix everything, and all that is wrong will be made right. Let's look at another Van Eyck painting. I won't take as much time with this one, but it's super famous. You need to know about it if you're going to be a well-educated grand tourist. It's called the Arnolfini Wedding or the Arnolfini Portrait. Instead of being a heavenly scene, this is a very sort of earthy scene. This painting was most likely commissioned by Mr. Arnolfini, the dude in the big, almost Dr. Seuss looking hat on the left-hand side of the painting. And this commemorates his wedding or his marriage to the woman on the right in green. Now, one of the first things that people latch onto is like, oh man, I think she's pregnant. And indeed, she does look pregnant. There are lots of theories about this, and this is something that art historians have argued for years and years and years. Is she pregnant or not? Uh, some theories say this is just the crazy kind of dresses they had back then. Other people say that she wasn't probably pregnant when they got married, but Van Eyck painted her pregnant to show that their marriage would be one that produced children, that there would be fertility in their marriage. And I kind of like this second theory because there are a lot of fertility images in this particular painting. For example, they're in the bedchamber. We actually see the marriage bed there on the right with the curtain pulled aside. There is, and this is really hard to see, the headboard of the bed has a little carving on it of Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth. So there are those components. Some other really great details, because remember, even in a painting like this that depicts everyday life, there's going to be some awesome symbolism in it if you're talking about the Northern Renaissance painters. There's this exquisitely detailed chandelier, and there's a single lit candle in it that represents the presence of God, uh, maybe the flame of the Holy Spirit. But since a wedding ceremony is being performed here in this room, God is present. The man's shoes have been taken off. He is just in his stockings, and you can see his wooden shoes there on the ground to the left, because in a sense, this is holy ground. Marriage is a sacrament, and so he's taken his shoes off to be on holy ground. There's this little dog at the bottom. Looks like a little annoying kind of yappy dog, but it is there as a symbol of faithfulness. You know, dogs are man's best friend, and so this dog is serving as a symbol that this is going to be a marriage in which both spouses are true to each other. By the way, the generic name for a dog, Fido, is Latin for fidelity or faithfulness. So if you ever wondered why that's kind of a stereotypical name for a dog, that is why. Last little detail in this painting, on the back wall is pretty much a masterpiece of miniature painting. There is a little mirror that is in a frame, and the mirror is a convex mirror that is reflecting the scene that is in the room. So we see Mr. Arnolfini and his wife, and then we see some figures between them, which I guess is us. That's the viewer. We've just come into the room. The entire room is reproduced in the mirror. You see the chandelier, you see the window and the bed. So essentially, Van Eyck painted this entire painting twice, once in the foreground and once in the mirror, which is just completely awesome. This is why he is so famous, and rightfully so. Now, one of the most stunning details in this painting is the frame around the mirror. It is illustrated with little tiny paintings that depict the Passion of Christ. If you look at the top one, you can see a crucifixion scene. So there's this thing is chock full of details. By the way, in this scene, this slide that has the two mirrors, you can see the little statue of Saint Margaret praying there on top of the headboard of the bed. There's also a little duster suggesting Mrs. Arnolfini is going to take care of household duties. And also, Van Eyck has put his signature on the wall. You can see that written in a very ornate style. This is just a marvelous work, and something that makes it even more amazing is it's not really a huge, huge painting. It's just kind of a medium-sized painting, and Van Eyck is busting out the little itsy-bitsy tiny brushes to do all of this detailing. But he is quintessential Northern Renaissance painter, someone who is absolutely in love with the surface of things. So don't forget that. That's really important. Well, if you couldn't already tell, it's probably pretty obvious. I'm nuts about Van Eyck. I think his work is fantastic. So I hate to leave him, but we're going to have to move on. And actually, I really like this next painter a lot too, but for very different reasons. This is Hieronymus Bosch. He was a Nederlandish painter. He was from the Netherlands, or modern day Holland. And we're just going to look at one work by him, but it is absolutely one of the most bizarre works ever produced in the entire history of painting. It is weird, 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 which is interesting because it's a religious work. It is an altarpiece, specifically a triptych. It has folding doors on it, kind of similar to the Ghent altarpiece by Van Eyck. But this one, instead of being a polyptych, is a true triptych. So here's the outside of this altarpiece, the Garden of Earthly Delights, and we see kind of a shot of the planet Earth. Um, I'm not sure if he's going for a flat Earth thing here, but we see the land surrounded by water, and then Earth has sort of a dome of the sky or the atmosphere, and you can see sort of boiling clouds inside of it. And look in the upper left corner, we see a figure sort of floating in space. That figure is God. And this should already be a little clue that the way Hieronymus Bosch treats God is going to be different from how Van Eyck treats him. Because when you're talking about Bosch's work, God is distant. He is kind of off and detached. He has set the world in motion and he's sitting back and waiting to see what's going to happen. And of course, that's different from Van Eyck, where God is extremely present in the painting, sort of the central figure. All right, let's open up the Garden of Earthly Delights and have a look inside. Kind of like the Ghent altarpiece, it's sort of dull on the outside and really colorful on the inside. But what a different sort of set of theological ideas that are being shown in the Bosch work. And in fact, you look at this and you're like, it's so busy. Where do I look? There's so many little things to look at. So I'm going to try to break it down section by section so we can figure out what is going on in Bosch's work. Just a quick overview while we have the thing open. On the left-hand side, that left panel, we have a scene from the Garden of Eden. And then in the middle panel, we have a scene of a debauched world. There are basically people who are living in sin and carousing and having an orgy. There are all these naked people, but remember, they're not idealized Southern humanist Italian naked people. They are sort of unidealized pale folks. But they are partying it up. They are totally having an orgy. And then on the right hand side of the right panel, I should say, is a scene from hell. So what we have is a progression here. We have Adam and Eve in the garden, and then between the first and the second panels, apparently the fall of humanity happens, and we have people living in a depraved, fallen state. And then on the right-hand side of the painting, we have the consequences of living in that sinful state. Bosch is someone who is apparently pretty cynical about humanity. He believes that mankind is a fallen mess and everybody's sort of doing their own thing and ignoring God and living in sin, and there are going to be consequences for that. So Bosch is pretty harsh uh, about the state of man's spiritual life. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what you call a low view of humanity. All right, let's break this down. Let's look at the left panel first. This is the Garden of Eden panel, and the sort of centerpiece of this panel is God presenting Eve to Adam for the first time. And God is kind of an unimpressive figure here. It's not like the powerful God of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. But there he is. There's Eve who looks down modestly, and Adam is looking up with interest, excited to have a woman in the garden. And look at all the weird stuff that's going on around them. Bosch not only apparently has strong views about the fallenness of humanity, he chooses to express those views in really weird ways. Look in front of Adam and Eve and God. There's this black pool that some animals are drinking out of or swimming around in. And we have all these little scenes of violence that are going on, sort of animal on animal violence. We have birds that are tearing apart a frog. We have a cat carrying a rat in its mouth. We have another strange looking creature who's devouring a frog. So these all seem to be foreshadowing of the fall that is to come. Uh, the fact that Adam and Eve are going to be eating from the forbidden fruit, and after that, things are going to get messed up in the world. And Bosch is giving us little hints of that in this first panel. Here's the middle panel. We assume the fall has already happened and all these people are living in sin. And Bosch doesn't paint necessarily what real human beings might be doing in an orgy. He gets at the idea of immorality and an orgy by having these people do really strange behaviors. We have people making out. We have people dancing with weird things on their heads. We have a dude whose head is upside down in water and he has, what is that? A piece of fruit balanced on his crotch. We have a guy bent over with flowers coming out of his rear end and another guy picking them. Really just strange imagery. And even today, art historians don't know what to do with all this. The main idea is pretty obvious, but the way Bosch has chosen to depict it is really strange. Here's a detail of the fountain that's in that middle panel, and you can see naked people hanging out on the fountain, doing headstands, kissing each other. Really strange. People have written a lot of articles about Bosch's use of what appears to be flasks and test tubes and stuff. Nobody can quite figure it out. Maybe it's references to the science or pseudoscience of alchemy. Who knows? Here's a close up of some people floating in a lake, and they're riding in this giant bubble on top of this floating flower looking thing. In the background, there's a dude hugging an owl. There are people riding ducks, and there's our guy with his head in the water balancing the fruit. So I still look at this, even after having seen it many, many times, and I'm kind of shocked. I want to say, what was Bosch thinking? This is from the 1500s. This is not from today. Okay, let's move on to the right-hand panel. We've set up the idea that humankind is sinful, and now in this hell, this vision of hell that we have in the right-hand panel, people are going to sort of reap the consequences of their immoral activities. But once again, Bosch chooses to get at the idea of punishment in very strange ways, using highly symbolic sorts of metaphors and bizarre, nightmarish imagery. Towards the bottom of the image, we just have a few of the strange tortures and activities that are going on in hell. There's this bird-headed creature, perhaps some sort of demon that has its feet in these two vases, and he is devouring a person, and there are birds flying out of this person's rear end. We also, below this figure, we have this big bubble thing, and it's almost like the figure is defecating out these people into the bubble, out of which they fall into a hole. You can see that under the throne. There's a guy leaning over and vomiting into the hole. There's another guy bent over and he's like pooping golden coins into this hellish toilet. There's a woman who's being groped by a demon in the foreground. There's a scene in the background. There's a guy with a flute coming out of his rear end, and he's supporting what looks like some sort of musical instrument that has a guy inside of it waving and some sort of fuse burning. Perhaps he is some type of human cannonball. I mean, who knows? And if you're scratching your head over this, saying, what the heck? You're in good company. Art historians have been scratching their heads over this for years and years and years. Here's another detail. One of the central figures in the scene of hell is this guy who has like tree trunk arms and his torso is hollow and there are people inside of it. There's a guy, again, with an arrow sticking in his rear, climbing up the ladder into this body. The guy is balancing on his head this tray around which demons prance, and there's some, maybe it's a musical instrument. It looks like a combination of a bagpipe and a stomach. And there's actually a little flag waving on the guy's torso that reproduces that bagpipe shape. There's what looks like a pair of ears that are being cut with a knife. All sorts of craziness going on in Bosch. If you email me saying, what is this about? I will have absolutely no answers for you because I don't know. But Bosch is definitely taking a moral stand here. Regardless of what the individual symbols mean, he's saying that people are messed up and they're fallen and there are consequences for that. Here's a last little detail. Here's a guy who is strapped to a boat and being drawn across an icy lake. There's some sort of bird holding a bow and arrow and wearing ice skates. And again, we have a little crop of our human cannonball. Okay, that is Bosch. By the way, Bosch is going to be really influential in the 20th century, on 20th century painters, even though he lived 400, 500 years before these painters. You're going to have Salvador Dali and the Surrealists look back at Bosch's work and say, this is inspirational. This is what we want to pattern our dreamlike imagery after. So he's going to be a big influence on them. Okay, Bosch is, again, a Dutch or Nederlandish artist from the Netherlands. let's hop over to Germany and close out this module with a couple of German artists who are really great. Our first is Matthias Grunwald, and he is known for one really impressive, important work called the Eisenheim Altarpiece. Here is a picture of the place where the altarpiece is on display. It's in a region that is in France now, even though he was a German painter. And it gives you a sense of the scale of this altarpiece. It's pretty big. You can see people walking around it. They have actually taken apart the altarpiece. It has multiple doors, and they have sort of laid out the doors vertically so you can see both sides of them. So that's kind of cool. We're only going to look at some of the paintings on this altarpiece. Let's begin with this first image, which gives us an overview of the outside of the altarpiece. This, as you might guess, is a crucifixion scene. And what's special about it is that art historians pretty much universally agree that this is about the most horrific crucifixion ever painted, that no other artwork even comes close to conveying human suffering and specifically what Jesus may have gone through on the cross as this painting right here. And it is like these other paintings we looked at, chock full of symbolism. It's going to be easier to interpret than Bosch's mysterious work. So let me walk you through what some of these things mean. There are two figures on the outside. On the left, we have St. Anthony. On the right, we have St. Sebastian. This particular altarpiece was originally located in a chapel that was associated with a monastic hospital. In other words, monks lived in this monastery and they basically ran this hospital and they served people who were sick and had diseases. And it was the Order of St. Anthony. So it makes sense that St. Anthony made it into this altarpiece as the patron saint of the order. On the far right, Saint Sebastian was a Christian martyr, and part of his martyrdom was him being tied to a column and being shot full of arrows. And back when this work was painted, it was believed that diseases were the result of sort of invisible arrows of sickness, disease, and pestilence sort of sticking into you. So Saint Sebastian was often invoked to ward off sickness and disease because he himself had been pierced for arrows. That's why he's there. In the lower section of the outside of this altarpiece, this is a zone called the predella. We have a lamentation scene. Jesus has been taken down from the cross and he's being mourned over and he's about to be placed in a tomb. This next image gives us a detail of the crucifixion scene that takes up the middle of the altarpiece. And it's easy to see why art historians think this is such an awful depiction of suffering, because it is. This seems to be an artistic embodiment of the 22nd Psalm. I'll just read you some excerpts from this because, by the way, this is the psalm that Jesus quotes part of when he's hanging on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Far from my deliverance are the words of my groaning. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there is none to help. Many bulls have surrounded me, they open wide their mouth at me. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and you lay me in the dust of death. For dogs have surrounded me, a band of evildoers has encompassed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. So this is very graphic language that the psalmist is using, and when Jesus was being crucified, he felt that this really fit his situation, so he quoted part of Psalm 22. But I feel like this painting is almost sort of a point-by-point interpretation of this psalm, for we can indeed count his bones, and his hands and his feet are pierced. If we look closely at his body, we definitely have the sense that his shoulders have been wrenched out of joint. And his skin clings to his body almost as if someone has stuck a vacuum cleaner in him and sucked his skin against all his ribs. One of the really horrifying aspects of this painting is all the little wounds from the lash that are inflicted on Christ's body. As we see in this detail, his entire form is covered with all of these marks, and there are even thorns that are embedded in his body. He hangs on the cross dead. His head is leaning over, his lips have turned blue, his feet are twisted in agony, and his hands are frozen in sort of rigor mortis contortions of one who died a gruesome, horrific death. And there's no part of his body that is untouched with some sort of suffering, with some sort of wound or mark. We can see that in the hands and the feet here, the wound where the nail drives into the hand. We see burning almost like lava the blood inside, and the wound around the nail starting to turn black. This is an unflinching depiction of suffering. And something that makes it even more powerful is the fact that people who were being treated at this monastic hospital in the 1500s, many of them were suffering from a disease called ergotism, or St. Anthony's fire. And in this disease, it was kind of like leprosy. It was sort of a blood poisoning disease. And you would have um, these wounds, these open running wounds that open up all over your skin, and you would lose some sensitivity in your nerve endings, and sometimes parts of your body would become diseased with gangrene, and limbs would have to be amputated. And something that's particularly chilling and also amazingly appropriate about this painting is that Christ has some of the same wounds that people suffering from ergotism would have. That's what these sores on their bodies look like. Furthermore, if you study the construction of the altarpiece, remember this has doors that open, and this painting, this crucifixion painting, actually has a seam in the middle. You can see it running vertically straight down the middle of the canvas, and this is where the painting comes apart and slides or swings open. And notice what happens to Christ's body when this painting is opened up. His arm comes off. He is actually has an amputation that's performed. And here's a shot of the predella, that little painting that is below the main painting. And this slides open as well. Look at the seam in it. When this is slid open, Christ loses his legs. So this painting becomes even more profound and powerful when you imagine people who have this disease, ergotism, going to this chapel and looking up at this painting. And these are people who have sores all over their bodies. Many of them are missing arms and legs. And they look up at this crucified Christ hanging there, and they see that he has wounds and amputations just like they do. And it creates this amazing connection between the audience and the subject of the work, for they say, here is one who has suffered as I have suffered. Here is one who knows what I'm going through. And even though life is really hard, at least I know that God, in the form of Christ, has not exempted himself from my suffering. In my opinion, this is one of the most appropriate context for a painting of this kind, a painting of suffering that is in a hospital. And I think that is deeply, deeply moving. Some details, just real quickly, on the crucifixion panel. We have, somewhat out of place, John the Baptist. He is the figure in red. At his feet is a lamb who is holding a little cross, and the lamb, similar to the lamb in the Ghent altarpiece, is bleeding into a chalice, a symbol of Christ's sacrifice. And John the Baptist points a finger at the crucified Christ, and there are words coming out of his mouth. He is saying, "It is fitting that he increase and I diminish." Now, John the Baptist was not actually alive at the time of the crucifixion. He'd been killed earlier. But Grunwald is interested in making sort of symbolic statements with this altarpiece. And so he plucks John the Baptist sort of out of time and space and places him at the crucifixion and gives him commentary uh, that is actually taken from Scripture. And over on the other side of the painting, we have three figures. They're very common figures to see in crucifixion scenes, so you should look for them. There is Mary, the mother of Jesus. She is in white, and she is fainting. Remember, we saw that with our Botticelli Lamentation painting. She's swooning or fainting, and John, the disciple, is catching her. At the foot of the cross is Mary Magdalene. She's wringing her hands in grief, and she has the alabaster jar at her feet. And behind all of these figures, darkness has fallen across the land. The Bible describes uh, things turning dark at the crucifixion of Jesus. Just before we leave this image, just look at it and look at how bleak it is. This is to me an image that speaks truth about human suffering and how hard life can be sometimes. And I went through a really difficult time in my life, a period of depression, wondering why God wasn't pulling me out of this depression. And this painting actually uh, was very meaningful to me during this time because it simply reminded me that God has not exempted himself from the pain and the mess of humanity, but has been willing to come down and suffer alongside us. And I think that's one of the reasons this painting has had such resonance for people over the centuries. And of course, to the original people who looked at it in that hospital chapel. Fortunately, though, it doesn't end on a bleak note. On the inside of this altarpiece, we open the panel and we have this glorious resurrection scene. We have the tomb that we saw from the front of the altarpiece in the lamentation scene. And Christ is rising out of the tomb, drawn upwards by the forces of heaven. Around him, the guards who were supposed to watch over the tomb are falling down. They're fainting, they're stumbling, they're becoming like dead men. Christ himself rises in glory, and it's still early morning. The sky is still dark, but he rises in this halo of light, and there are all these little sparks coming off of the halo, crackling embers, or they almost seem like fireflies or stars that surround this brilliant circle of light, in the middle of which is Christ himself. And the light is so brilliant that the edges of his head kind of dissolve, and we just see his mouth and his eyes looking back at us. Look at the way Christ raises his hands. He presents his wounds to us, and the wounds in his hands and his feet are actually glowing. Um, in a sense, these have now become healing wounds. After all, Scripture says, by his wounds we are healed. And Grunwald almost wants to literally demonstrate this by showing power, glowing power, coming out of the holes in his hands and his feet. This is an image of triumph, of Jesus conquering death, and he almost seems to hold up his hands to say, look, I have conquered. And his body is restored. All of those marks, of course, except for the holes in his hands and his feet, all those marks are gone. And he has been given a remade body. By the way, I should also say that the wound in his side is also glowing. So just a really triumphant, hopeful thing. And imagine again what it was like for the people who just had these messed up bodies to open this altarpiece and see that someday they too could be restored, that someday their bodies would be made whole again. And that's a really hopeful message. What I love about the Eisenheim altarpiece is that it's unflinching. It is not cheesy Christian bookstore art. It is art that speaks truth about suffering in the world, yet also speaks truth to the Christian notion that suffering will someday be alleviated, that Christ has led the way and death will be conquered. Okay, the last painting we're going to look at is by another German artist, a guy named Hans Holbein. It's called The Ambassadors, and it's a double portrait. The man on the left is named Jean de Dintville. The dude on the right is named Georges de Selve. And these guys are both basically diplomats, and they're also very learned men. They have had a lot of education, and that is reflected by all the stuff that is on this table thing that's between them. We have, for example, a globe suggesting that they are well traveled. We have a musical instrument, some sort of lute that's there on the lower level. And these guys are also pretty well to do, right? They have very impressive clothes. And I mean, the guy on the left almost looks like Henry VIII or something. Just super rich and super smart. So they have everything in the world going for them. What's great is there's a little moral lesson that is embedded in this painting. Look at the bottom. You may have already seen it and wondered about it. There's this strange, distorted object that reaches out diagonally across the bottom. And look at it. See if you can tell what it is. In this next slide, I have actually sort of digitally compressed it so you can see what it is if you couldn't tell already. It's a skull. It's a distorted skull in this picture. And this is what we call a memento mori. Do you remember that word from the very beginning of this podcast, Latin for reminder of death, a reminder that you're going to die. And this is just any symbol that's included in a painting that reminds the viewer that life is brief and all of us are headed towards the grave eventually. And this stretched out, distorted skull is serving as a memento mori in this. Even though these men have everything one could want in the world, just like us, they are going to die someday. So it's kind of an interesting reminder that death is the great leveler. There's another religious symbol in this painting. Look very carefully in the upper left of the painting. The curtain is drawn aside and we see a crucifix. We see Jesus on the cross there in the upper left. Just a hint, as if Jesus himself is looking down on them. So there's been a lot of speculation about the presence of this skull in the painting. Why, for example, did Holbein decide to stretch it out and distort it instead of just putting it in as another object on the table? One possibility is that this painting may have been initially intended to be viewed on a stairwell, on a wall that's on a landing of a stairwell. So as you're coming up the stairs and then looking up at the painting, you might have been looking at it from a low angle to the side, making the skull come into view. We don't really know. But I tell you what, this painting is a good one to close on when we're thinking about the Northern Renaissance because it is full of that Northern Renaissance love of surface detail. Look at the floor. Look at the exquisite decoration on the floor. Look at the embroidered curtain in the back, their clothing. Everything is just carefully painted. And this painting, I believe, is in the National Gallery in London. I have very vivid memories of it because I got really close to it and made an alarm go off or something. That's what I always think of when I think of this. I think I was trying to squat down and look at the skull. But there it is, super famous and a great kind of capstone to this section on the Northern Renaissance. Definitely one of my favorite periods in art. And that wraps it up. I will see you in the next module.